Thanks, Jim. That scares me. I'm just not going to look at these lights now. What I want to talk about today is some work I've been doing with the modeling of complex systems. And here's one complex system that pretty much everybody in the room is familiar with. Here's another one known as our brain. And I've been modeling the brain for the last 30 years or so. And for the last couple of years, I've also started modeling the climate. Now, why would one want to do that? The answer is that I would argue that there's a very uneasy partnership between those two complex systems, our planet on the one hand and our brain on the other hand. And I want to make 3 points today to illustrate that. The first thing I'm going to tell you is that people are ill-calibrated with some planetary constraints. The second thing I want to talk about is some amplifying loops and tipping points, not in the climate system, but in our cognitive system that can be triggered by climate change. And finally, on a bit of good news, if I have time, I'll get around to that. I'll say that, yes, this matters, but it can be managed. So let's start talking about the uneasy partnership, in particular tissue paper. That turns out to be important. Take a fine piece of tissue paper, 1/50th of a millimeter, fold it upon itself 50 times. Then ask yourself, how thick would that paper be? It turns out the answer is something like a little more than 20 million kilometers. And the reason is that when you start out doubling, by the time you've doubled something tiny 50 times, you end up with a huge number. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters because economic growth means you double the size of the economy every so often. At 3%, it takes you 23 years to double it. By the time you grow at the rate of China, these are the figures for the last couple of years, you double the economy every 7 or 10 years. Do that for 100 years or 200 years, and all of a sudden you're entering the territory of tissue paper that I was just talking about, where things just become enormously big. Now, do people understand this? And the answer in a nutshell is no. If you ask participants in an experiment to predict what the rise of the economy is going to be in 25 years, given an annual rate of 1%, 3%, or 5%, then what happens is that people vastly underestimate the outcome as soon as the growth rate goes above 1% or 3% when the nonlinearity kicks in. There's a huge deficit between the true value and what people think will happen. And when I say people here, I'm talking also about experts. I'm talking about people who are presented with graphical aids. I'm talking about a wide variety of circumstances where people fail to understand the concept of exponential growth, including the economists who think that that is the way to go. So we have a bit of a problem there, something we've got to be aware of. Another miscalibration that I want to tell you about involves scientific uncertainty and its effects on climate change. Now, what we've done here, I'm reporting some stuff that's partially published but partially new, where we ran a very simple climate model and created a number of hypothetical worlds with 10,000 realizations each, where the mean climate sensitivity was kept constant at 3 degrees, but the uncertainty was varied from very little to very large. Now, we then fed the projections from that simple climate emulator through a semi-empirical model for sea level rise, and we now have projections for sea level rise to the end of the century under various different scenarios of uncertainty. Little uncertainty, a lot of uncertainty, but mean sensitivity remains constant in all cases. Now, there's a lot that can be said about this. I want to focus on the triangles here and there, which are the height, or which represent the height of sea level defenses that are required in order to keep the risk of inundation constant from the present to the end of the century. And what you can see here is that that triangle goes from about 100 centimeters to about 200. It doubles in height as a function of uncertainty about climate sensitivity. So the greater the uncertainty about the evolution of the climate, the greater the risk that is posed from climate change. And the greater, there are all sorts of other issues, and if you're interested in that, that's a partial source for what I'm talking about here. So in the physical world, greater uncertainty means greater risk. Now, what about the cognitive world? What about inside our heads? What do people do when they're presented with different types of uncertainty? Well, what I'm showing you here is some data from a recent experiment. This is as yet unpublished, hot off the press, where what we're doing is we're presenting our participants in the laboratory with scenarios about the future. And we give them a choice. We say, here's one scenario, there's another one, and it just so happens that they differ in the variance or in the uncertainty surrounding their predictions. And the cover story is that one of them is from NGO X and the other one is from NGO Y or some other fictitious outfit, and we basically give people a choice. And what we ask them is to indicate which of the two projections they prefer as a response to certain questions. So the graph here tells you what the experiment was about, and it also shows you the data. Let me start out by drawing your attention to the two thumbnails here. The one up there has a lot of uncertainty. The one at the bottom has very little uncertainty. And people would see those kind of representations, as it turns out, not as a graph, but as a text vignette. But the idea is the same. And they then have to say, which of those makes you more concerned? Does this worry you or does that worry you more? And which poses a greater threat? Is it that one with a little uncertainty or that one with a greater uncertainty? Now, the mean projection is the same in both cases. The only thing that differs is the uncertainty about the mean estimate. And here are the data. What you can see is that people, statistically significantly, prefer the projection with the lower uncertainty, the lesser uncertainty, and they find that more concerning, and they find that that presents a greater threat. Now that is remarkable because it's the opposite of what is actually true in the climate system. In the climate system, the greater the uncertainty, as I've just shown, the greater the risk and the more you should worry about the future. But people do the opposite. And that is because greater uncertainty, such as shown over here, tends to lull people into more wishful thinking. Because if it could be anything, oh, well, then it can't be that bad, because people instinctively prefer or focus on the lower end of the distribution. And we have other data to show that. If you get people to elicit the probability distribution, the subjective probability distribution for the outcomes, you find that they put more probability mass on the lower end, confirming this idea of wishful thinking. So people in general are not very well calibrated with some constraints, some real climatic constraints and economic constraints. Now, it gets a little more interesting, or worse, when you look at tipping points and feedback loops. Now, what I've shown here on the left are just a couple of scary things that we all know about. You know, there are sort of these amplifications in the climate system, potentially. Ice albedo, as it melts, there's less albedo, hence more heat, et cetera, et cetera. We have methane, we have forest fires that might put soot on Greenland, so there's less albedo, all these kinds of things in the physical world. Now, what about the cognitive world? What happens inside people's heads? Now, to my mind, to my knowledge, no one has actually looked at that much. And what I want to tell you about now are just a couple of studies that arguably point to the existence of a parallel set of cognitive tipping points, quote unquote, or amplifications that we should be concerned about. Now, I'm presenting this for illustration primarily to raise awareness of the existence of these consequences. But there's a lot of research that remains to be done to pin this down. Now, here's one study that was published a couple of years ago by Imo Fritchi and colleagues, where they showed that if you remind people, members of the public, if you remind them of climate change and the adverse consequences associated with that, people became more authoritarian. That is, they called for harsher punishment of thieves and rapists or whatever it was. That was the variable that was being measured. Now, at first glance, there's absolutely no connection between climate change and punishment of criminals. And yet, the reminding of climate change elicited in people a generally more authoritarian attitude. And for example, they derogated out groups more, and it is the fact that the derogation of out groups that I want to focus on, because if there's one notable out group we know about, it is refugees. Certainly in some countries they're not particularly welcome. And we now have a perfect storm. We have climate change giving us more refugees. The estimates vary, but we can expect there to be a fair number. And at the same time, the same process that gives us refugees gives us this cognitive response in people's heads that I've just talked about, which means that people by and large become more likely to consider refugees to be an outgroup and somebody who's not particularly well liked. So what do we have? We have a lot of refugees, and we have a lot of opposition or dislike of refugees being triggered arguably by the same physical process. That's not good news. Here's another one that's not good news. People turn out to be sensitive to the level of infectious diseases, and if people perceive that there is a high level of infection around them, they again become ethnocentric, xenophobic, they distrust others. And anybody who wants to have this illustrated, I think there is something known as fear-bola that apparently recently swept this country. And imagine what will happen if climate change kicks in, which we know is going to give us more infectious diseases. Well, that in turn can give us more ethnocentrism, xenophobia, distrust, which are all psychological attributes that get in the way of solving the problem and dealing with those crises. So those are just illustrations of the types of things that we could arguably worry about if we were inclined to do that. However, it's not all bad news. And the reason I don't think it's necessarily bad news is because we know that people are flawed. Cognitive scientists know that. We know that people, for example, never save enough for retirement. Does that mean anybody who retires dies in poverty? Well, no, because in most countries we put laws in place for people to make mandatory contributions, tax breaks, and so on to encourage saving for retirement, because we know what our limitations are, and we can deal with that through clever taxation. The same thing is true for organ donations. We know that people forget to sign up for them, so we just make them the default and have people opt out. That triples organ donation rates. And my hope and my conclusion is that even if we know that people are ill-calibrated to deal with planetary challenges, that doesn't prevent us from knowing about that and safeguarding the future nonetheless through clever policies. Thank you.
Okay, we've got time for one or two questions.
No? Good, fine. Oh.
So talk a little more about the exponentials problem. I mean, from technology, people got used to having Moore's law around for a long time, and it always has tended to surprise people. So is that sort of an ingrained thing, or where does that come from?
Well, I don't know. It's a very good point, because exponential growth obviously can last for a long time, which is part of its problem. Because if you look at exponential growth retroactively, you never perceive a problem, right? Until the very last doubling that blows you out of whatever the spaces you've got, you can't know that there is a problem. Because prior to the last doubling, you've only taken up 50% of the available space. It's just you double it one more time and kaboom, there is your problem, because you're at 100% or beyond. So the trick about exponential growth isn't just that people don't understand it, but also that looking back on it tells you nothing.